The airport was always a place of beginnings for me. New missions, new deployments, new horizons. But that morning, as I whirled my small black suitcase through the sliding glass doors, I didn't feel the rush of anticipation. I felt a heaviness in my chest that I couldn't name yet. The terminal buzzed with motion, families clustering at check-in counters, couples bickering about boarding passes, children dragging brightly colored backpacks and across the scuffed tile floors. I was 44 years old, a retired Air Force colonel with 22 years of service, and for once, this trip wasn't about duty. It was supposed to be about family, about mending fences I wasn't sure could be mended. For months, I'd imagined it as a kind of quiet reconciliation. 3 days in Savannah, a rented historic home on a shady street, evenings spent over dinner instead of old grievances. I'd booked the flights, the house, the excursions. I'd paid for it all without blinking, because deep down I thought maybe generosity could bridge the years of distance. That hope lasted until my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. 7 words, no punctuation, no explanation, just no place, don't come back. It took my brain a moment to arrange the meaning. I stood frozen in the check-in line, my boarding pass half printed on the kiosk screen. 1,000 possible explanations rushed in at once. Was it a joke, a wrong number, a mistake autocorrect had turned cruel? I reread it again and again, each time feeling the weight of it press deeper into my chest. I knew better. This was no mistake. I typed back only 2 words, understood, goodbye. When I slipped my phone back into my pocket, the line had moved ahead without me. The man behind me cleared his throat impatiently, and I forced my body to step forward. People around me laughed, argued, scrolled on their phones. The world moved as it always did, indifferent to the small implosions happening in someone's chest. I thought I'd built armor over the years, deployment after deployment, loss after loss, but nothing in the desert, no mission gone wrong, no folded flag handed to a grieving spouse, had prepared me for being told I wasn't wanted. Not just for the trip, but not anywhere. I told myself to breathe, to focus. I'd already paid for everything. My name was on the boarding pass. There was nothing to stop me from going except pride, and pride had kept me standing on worse days than this. Still, as I handed my ID to the TSA agent, I caught my reflection in the glass panel beside her booth. My own eyes looked back at me, sharper than I remembered, but with something trembling just under the surface, something breakable. Security was a blur. Shoes off, laptop out, hands in the air for the scanner. A young man ahead of me argued about his bottle of water, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, how small some battles were compared to the one boiling quietly in my chest. At the gate, my family was already there, 3 rows of them in matching first-class seats, their carry-ons neatly tucked above them. My mother's cream sweater stood out like a flag in the crowd, her sunglasses perched as though the fluorescent lights might harm her delicate sensibilities. My father sat beside her, head tilted back, eyes closed in his practiced indifference. My brother Nathan was flanked by his wife and their 2 perfect children, all of them focused on anything but me. They didn't look up, didn't nod, didn't even acknowledge that I existed. I sat in 12C, close enough to see them when I craned my neck, far enough to pretend they weren't there. I told myself I could still salvage the weekend, even if it wasn't spent together. I could find my own way in Savannah, see the moss-draped oaks, maybe take a riverboat tour alone. I'd done harder things alone. The boarding door was still open when my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from them. It was a reminder from the airline app. Boarding closes in 5 minutes. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt like I was walking towards something I couldn't quite name. A cliff edge I wouldn't see until I was already in the air. I adjusted my bag under the seat in front of me and looked out the window. The tarmac gleamed under a pale morning sun. A baggage cart rattled by, stacked with suitcases in colors as varied as the people they belonged to. Somewhere out there, my own small black bag waited to be loaded. I didn't know it yet, but that morning was the first real step into something I'd been avoiding my whole life. Not just the end of hope for reconciliation, but the start of a different kind of war. One fought without weapons, without orders. One where the battlefield was measured in glances, in silence, in the refusal to be erased. And in the seat in front of me, my family, my blood, was already drawing their lines. The first time they truly cut me off, I was 19. It was the summer before my second year at the Air Force Academy. I'd been home in Charlotte for a short break. A brief, awkward return to a house that never quite felt like mine. The weather was oppressive, the kind of thick Carolina heat that stuck to your skin like a second layer. But inside, the air was cold from the hum of an overworked AC unit. That day, I'd been sitting on the back porch in uniform, polishing my shoes, because the smell of leather and polish calmed me in a way nothing else did. The screen door squeaked, then slammed. My mother stepped out with that rigid grace she always carried, a porcelain mug of coffee in one hand. Her lips were already pressed into a thin line before she spoke. "Your father and I think you should reconsider this military thing," she said, her voice flat. "You're wasting your potential." I remember blinking at her, the sunlight catching in her sunglasses so I couldn't see her eyes. "Wasting my potential?" I asked slowly. "I'm doing exactly what I want to do." "That's the problem," she snapped. "Always chasing what you want. Always about you. What about the family's reputation? Do you think people respect a girl who runs off to play soldier instead of building a real life?" The word girl hit me harder than the rest. I was 19, an adult by every measure, yet to her I was still a child playing pretend in a man's world. Before I could respond, Nathan stepped out behind her. He was 22, still living at home after college, working at my father's firm. He leaned casually against the doorframe, his smile carrying just the right amount of smugness. "She's just mad because you're not doing what she tells you," he said lightly, but the smirk told me he was enjoying this. It's always been her thing. Control. My mother turned sharply toward him. "Nathan, go back inside." He held up his hands in mock surrender, but before disappearing, he glanced at me and mouthed, "Told you." I didn't need him to tell me. I'd known for years that my presence in this house was conditional. Conditional on compliance, conditional on obedience, conditional on being the kind of daughter who didn't challenge the hierarchy they'd built around themselves. That day, when I went inside to grab a glass of water, I found my duffel bag sitting by the front door. My father was in the living room, reading the paper like nothing was unusual. "You can't stay here," he said without looking up. I froze. "What are you talking about?" "My flight back isn't for another week." "We've decided it's best if you go back early," he said, his voice as neutral as if he were discussing the weather. "You've made things tense around here?" Tense? That was their word for it. Tense meant I had an opinion they didn't approve of. Tense meant I existed outside of their control. I remember standing there trying to decide if this was worth fighting for. The room smelled faintly of my mother's perfume, the kind she sprayed before church. A photograph of Nathan in his graduation gown sat on the mantel, smiling down like the golden child he was. And there I was, halfway out the door in more ways than one. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I picked up my duffel, walked out to the driveway, and sat on the curb until my best friend Emily came to get me. She let me crash on her couch until my flight back to Colorado. It was the first time they had truly shut me out, but it wouldn't be the last. That moment set the tone for the years ahead. a quiet understanding that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I achieved, there would always be a point where they could and would turn the lock on me. Back then, I told myself it was temporary, that if I just kept proving myself, if I just made them proud enough, they'd stop. That somehow my service, my rank, my medals would change the way they saw me. What I didn't understand yet was that it was never about what I did. It was about who I was and who I wasn't willing to become. The road back to the academy that summer felt endless, every mile stretching the space between me and the idea of family. I thought distance would dull the sting. It didn't. It just taught me to expect the cutoff before it came. That day on the porch was the beginning of a war that wouldn't look like a war to anyone else. No gunfire, no casualties, anyone would count. Just a slow erosion of belonging, one silent exile at a time. And years later, standing in that airport with their message still burning in my pocket, I realized nothing had changed. They were still willing to cast me out without a backward glance. The only difference now was that I was no longer 19, and I was no longer afraid of what happened when I stopped trying to earn my place. If you want to understand how deep a wound goes, you have to start with the people who made it. My family was never the kind you saw in Christmas commercials. No warm embraces around the tree, no raucous laughter over burnt turkey. We were polished, controlled, picture frames straightened with precision, dinner served on the dot, emotions filed away like clutter in a locked drawer. My mother, Margaret Hale, had a reputation in the neighborhood for elegance and good taste. She hosted charity luncheons in floral dresses, her pearls catching the afternoon light, her voice always low and measured. To outsiders, she was a model of poise and hospitality. Inside our house, she was different. Her praise was rare, her criticism sharp enough to cut without raising her voice. She didn't yell, she didn't need to. A single tilt of her head could make you feel like you'd failed some invisible test. My father, Charles, was a quieter force, but no less formidable. He built a thriving construction firm from the ground up, or so the story went. He lacked control, liked knowing every moving piece of a project was under his hand. He carried that same philosophy into our home, though in practice it meant checking out of anything emotional. If you came to him for comfort, you'd find him behind the newspaper, murmuring vague phrases like, "You'll be fine," without looking up. And then there was Nathan, 3 years older than me, the golden child. Nathan had the kind of easy charm that made people forgive his faults before they even registered. Teachers adored him, coaches fought to have him on their teams, and my parents, well, they glowed around him. I can still see my father's hand on Nathan's shoulder, the way his chest swelled when he said, "That's my boy." I never once heard him say the equivalent to me. Growing up, the division wasn't always loud, it was in the subtleties. Nathan's half-burnt science project earning a small party in the living room, while my award-winning essay earned a distracted, good job. Nathan getting the family car without asking, me having to account for every mile I drove. He was the sun in our household, and I was the shadow that made him shine brighter. By the time I was a teenager, I'd stopped expecting fairness, but I still craved acknowledgement. That was the trap, thinking maybe, just maybe, one more achievement would tip the scale. When I received my acceptance to the Air Force Academy, I thought surely this was it. Surely this was the kind of thing that would make them see me. I left the letter on the kitchen counter that day, imagining my mother would call me into the room with a rare smile. My father would shake my hand. Nathan might even tease me in that half-proud, half-condescending way he did when he didn't know how to express real admiration. Instead, my mother folded the letter neatly in half and slid it under the morning paper. "This is a lot to think about," she said, as though I'd told her I was considering dyeing my hair. My father didn't even comment. Nathan smirked from his cereal bowl. "Guess you like taking orders," he said. I learned something valuable in that moment. Some people don't acknowledge you, not because you haven't done enough, but because they've already decided they won't. Fast forward to the present, seeing them at the airport that morning was like stepping into an old photograph. My mother in cream, Nathan in tailored casuals, my father leaning back as if the entire world bored him. They looked exactly the same as they had in my 20s, in my 30s, and I, standing with my boarding pass in hand, was exactly where they expected me to be, somewhere behind them, out of sight. They didn't wave, didn't nod. Not even when the gate attendant made a small joke about family vacations while scanning my ticket. They just boarded first, as first-class passengers always do, leaving me behind in a different line. It would have been easier if I didn't care. If I could truly say I'd stopped wanting anything from them. But in that moment, watching the back of Nathan's head disappear into the jet bridge, I felt the old familiar ache settle in. Not for their approval, not anymore, but for the years I'd spent bending myself into shapes they could never accept. I found my seat in 12C and pretended to busy myself with my bag, but my eyes kept straying forward, the way my mother leaned toward Nathan to say something with a small smile, the way my father rested his arm casually on the shared armrest, comfortable in a way I'd never seen him around me, the way all of them looked like they belonged to each other. The truth? They did belong to each other. I was just the misfit piece of the puzzle, one they'd been quietly sanding down for years, hoping I'd finally fit or finally break. And as much as I told myself I was immune, I could feel it happening again, the slow grind of being erased. This time, though, I didn't know they were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. I didn't realize I'd hit rock bottom until I was already there. It happened halfway through boarding. I'd stowed my carry-on under the seat in front of me, slipped my jacket off, and was scrolling idly through my phone when a shadow fell across my aisle. I looked up into the polished smile of a flight attendant, a young woman in her late 20s, hair pulled back in a sleek bun, tablet tucked against her side like a shield. "Mom," she began, her tone polite, but tinged with that brittle formality I'd heard countless times before. "I'm very sorry, but we have a family further up who would like to sit together. They've asked if you could possibly switch seats so they can be accommodated." I already knew. I didn't need her to point them out, but she did anyway. Her eyes flicked toward row 8, left side, and there they were, my family. My mother sitting ramrod straight, sunglasses perched as if the cabin lighting might blind her. My father half asleep in that practiced disinterest. Nathan, flanked by his wife and 2 perfectly dressed children. They didn't turn around, not one of them. I felt something hollow open up in my chest. The flight attendant kept talking, something about comfort and appreciation, but I'd stopped hearing her. All I could see was my mother adjusting her scarf, my father thumbing through a magazine, Nathan helping his youngest with the seatbelt. They were the picture of a family traveling together, except for me. "They requested this?" I asked quietly. "Yes, Mom," the attendant replied, her eyes flickering with something that might have been discomfort or maybe pity. "They said you were traveling together but preferred to adjust seating for comfort." Comfort. The word stung like a slap, as if I was the discomfort they needed to remove. I could have said no. I had every right to. I'd booked the tickets, paid for the upgrade. My name was on the seat. I could have refused without explanation, without apology, but I didn't. I unbuckled my seatbelt without a word and gathered my jacket. The attendant's smile softened a fraction, but she gestured toward the back of the plane, already moving on to her next task. I walked the narrow aisle past their row. My eyes didn't meet theirs. Not my mother's, who kept her gaze locked out the window. Not my father's, who didn't look up from his magazine. Not Nathan's, though I caught a flicker of his eyes, quick and empty. It was the same look he'd given me when we were kids, and he'd taken the last slice of cake, like I didn't even factor into the equation. The farther I walked, the colder it felt. Passengers glanced up as I passed, some with curiosity, some with disinterest. No one spoke, no one asked. Row 30, middle seat, no legroom, no window, no dignity. The man on my left barely shifted to let me in. The teenager on my right had headphones on, his knees jutted out into my space. I sat down carefully, rested my hand on my lap, and kept my face neutral. It wasn't a new feeling. I'd been erased before. But something about this, about the deliberate, public nature of it, cut deeper than I expected. They hadn't just moved me. They'd made sure everyone in first class saw me being moved. That was the point. I thought of the last time I'd been in that house, 7 years earlier, returning from a tour in the Middle East with a shattered knee. I remembered sitting in their living room, leg propped up, crutches leaning against the wall. My mother brought me tea because she felt obligated, not because she wanted to. My father read the newspaper. Nathan didn't visit at all. At one point, she'd looked at me and said, "I never understood why you had to make everything so hard, Caroline." I'd stared at her, thinking of the dust and the fire, the men I'd carried out of burning vehicles, the lives I'd watched slip away in my arms, and she was worried about a stain on the carpet. That had been the last time I crossed their threshold. Until now. The hum of the engines was a low, steady throb beneath my feet. The air in the back of the plane smelled faintly of old coffee and disinfectant. I adjusted my position, trying to find space for my knee, but there was none. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd survived worse. But the truth was, this wasn't about the seat. It was about what it represented. The years of being pushed to the margins, of making myself small so they could be comfortable, and somewhere deep inside I felt something shift, not break, but sharpen, a quiet decision forming. They thought they'd humiliated me. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. You can only be pushed so far before something inside you hardens into steel. For me, that process had started years earlier, long before this flight. It had been forged in the sand and heat of foreign soil under skies that shimmered with both beauty and danger. I was 22 when I first stood on the parade ground at Maxwell Air Force Base, my brand new officer's insignia glinting in the morning sun. My uniform was crisp, my boots mirror-shined, and my heart was pounding. Not from nerves, but from a sense of belonging I'd never felt in my own home. No one here cared about my last name. They cared about whether I could do the job, whether I could lead, whether I could be trusted when the stakes were life and death. The military didn't just give me structure, it gave me purpose. I was good at it too. I learned to navigate the politics of command, to make decisions when there was no time for hesitation, to keep my voice steady when others broke. My family would never understand that world, but it didn't matter. I wasn't doing it for them. Still, the cost was real. I learned the weight of loss early. In Kandahar, I watched a young airman bleed out in my arms. His eyes locked on mine until the light left them. In Baghdad, I led a rescue under fire, dragging 2 men to safety with shrapnel burning in my leg. And in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, I made the call to go into a burning transport when protocol said to wait. I pulled 3 men out. One of them was a captain named Michael Jennings, though I wouldn't know how important that fact would be until years later. But for every victory, there were losses I couldn't erase. The one that left the deepest scar was James. We met on deployment, a logistics officer with a crooked smile and a knack for making the worst days bearable. We talked about Vermont, about opening a bakery after we got out, about how maybe, just maybe, two people like us could build something soft in a world that was anything but. One morning, while I was briefing for a mission, James's convoy was hit. Roadside bomb, no survivors. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I folded the letter and tucked it into my field journal, then went back to work. But something inside me shifted that day. I stopped letting people in, stopped imagining futures that involved anyone else. By the time I retired at 41, I was different. Not just older, but sharper, harder in ways you couldn't see. The medals in my shadow box told a story, but not the whole one. The real story was in the things I'd lost, in the nights I couldn't sleep, in the way my shoulders stayed squared even in civilian clothes. Civilian life was strange. I didn't miss the danger, but I missed the clarity. Out there, you knew who was with you and who wasn't. Back home, betrayal came dressed in smiles and polite conversation. That's why when I got the invitation to join the family trip, an invitation that came with the subtext of obligation, I saw it as a test. Maybe they'd finally recognized that I wasn't the rebellious daughter they'd painted me to be. Maybe they'd seen that I'd built a life worthy of respect. So I booked the tickets, paid for everything without hesitation, told myself it didn't matter if they never said thank you. The point was to be in the same space again. But sitting in that cramped seat at the back of the plane, my knee aching in the cold air, I realized this wasn't about them anymore. This was about me. About what I was willing to tolerate, about the line between humility and humiliation. I thought about the people I'd served with, the ones who'd never come home, the ones who would have given anything for one more day to live fully. I thought about how many times I'd stood in the face of danger without blinking, how many times I'd been underestimated and proven people wrong. And then I thought about my family, who had never once seen me for who I truly was. That's when the resolve settled in. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to make a scene, but I was done playing their game. If they wanted me invisible, I'd let them think I was. Until the moment I chose to step into the light in a way they couldn't ignore. The military taught me many things. Patience was one of them. And as the engines hummed beneath me, I began to plan. Not in hours or days, but in the long, deliberate way you plan an operation. I would wait, I would watch, and when the moment came, I would move with precision, because some battles are won not by force, but by timing, and they had just given me the perfect reason to start. When I landed back in Charlotte 3 weeks after that flight, I didn't go home. I didn't even drive past the old neighborhood. I checked into a small furnished apartment on the other side of the city. Neutral walls, mismatched furniture, nothing that felt permanent. I wasn't planning to stay long, I was planning to disappear, not vanish entirely. No, that would have been too easy for them. I wanted to be close enough to watch, far enough to keep them guessing. I told no one I'd retired early from the security consulting work I'd picked up after the Air Force. As far as my family knew, I was still living 2 states away. Every morning, I'd jog a loop through a nearby park, my baseball cap pulled low. Some habits never fade, eyes scanning the perimeter, noting who passed me twice, which vehicles idled too long. People assumed I was just another early riser. They didn't know I was a ghost in plain sight. I started mapping their routines. Nathan dropped his kids off at school at precisely 7:50 every weekday, his black Range Rover idling at the curb like a glossy predator. My father still opened the office at 8:30 sharp, even though he'd stepped down from daily operations. My mother ran her errands mid-morning, dressed as if each grocery run were a photo shoot. I didn't follow them every day, just enough to piece together a picture. Enough to know where they felt safe, where their guard slipped. The truth was, I wasn't sure what I wanted yet. Revenge wasn't the right word, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't want them to feel some sliver of what they'd made me feel on that flight. No, what I wanted was balance. To tip the scale just enough that they'd have to see me, acknowledge me, even if only for a moment. One rainy Thursday, I found my moment. I was parked across from the Hales & Co.'s office building, my father's pride and joy, its glass facade reflecting the storm clouds above, when a familiar figure emerged, my father, trench coat buttoned, umbrella tucked under his arm, heading for his car. He moved slower these days, but there was still that air of unshakable control. A young man in a delivery uniform jogged up behind him, waving a clipboard. My father didn't see the delivery van half on the curb, the back doors wide open. I recognized the driver immediately. Todd Clayton, a contractor my father had cut ties with years ago after a messy payment dispute. Todd's expression wasn't friendly. I was out of my car before I even decided to move. Old instincts don't wait for permission. "Mr. Hale," I called, crossing the street fast enough to draw his attention. Todd froze when he saw me. There's a certain look people get when they realize they're facing someone who's not going to hesitate. That's what I saw in his eyes. He dropped the clipboard into a puddle and backed toward his van. My father blinked at me, rain dripping from his umbrella. "Caroline," he said, as if my name tasted foreign in his mouth. "Get in the car," I told him. My tone left no room for debate. He obeyed, perhaps without realizing it. I stood in the rain until Todd's van pulled away, then walked over to my father's car. I didn't open the door, didn't lean in. I just said, "You're welcome." For a moment, he stared at me, really stared. The way he might have looked at me if I'd been someone else, someone worth seeing. Then his jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here." I almost laughed. The rain had soaked through my jacket, cold water tracing down my spine, but I felt nothing. "Neither should you," I said. Then I turned and walked back to my car without looking back. That was when I knew I had the upper hand, not because I'd saved him, he'd never thank me for that, but because now he knew I was here, moving in the same space as him, close enough to touch the edges of his comfort. For the next month, I kept my distance again, watched from the periphery, slipped into the back of restaurants where I knew they dined, sat 2 rows behind them at Nathan's daughter's school play, walked past my mother in the produce aisle without a flicker of recognition from her. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was a shadow in their world, one they couldn't quite pin down. And shadows, I knew, could unsettle even the most confident opponent. What I didn't realize then was that the real opportunity would come without me lifting a finger. It would come on their own stage, in their own theater, with me as the uninvited guest they couldn't remove. The seat they'd once taken from me was about to become the center of everything. The invitation arrived in the mail, thick cardstock with embossed lettering that smelled faintly of expensive cologne. It was for the annual Hale Family Foundation Gala, a glittering event my parents hosted every spring for the city's elite. I'd never been invited before, not once. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, then I realized it wasn't. This was strategy. The gala was where my parents polished their reputation, where Nathan played the charming heir apparent, and where they could display me like an artifact if I came at all. A retired Air Force officer on their guest list looked good, kept up appearances. They were betting I wouldn't come, that I'd stay absent so they could control the story. I decided I'd attend, not in their image, not as the dutiful daughter in a muted dress, but as myself. The night of the gala, the Hale mansion glowed like something out of a magazine. strings of lights draped across the columns, the gravel driveway lined with black sedans and glossy sports cars. I arrived in a tailored black gown that moved like water when I walked. My hair was swept up, not in the rigid style my mother preferred, but loose enough to frame my face. The silver star ribbon sat discreetly on the left side of my chest. I wanted it there not for vanity, but as a quiet reminder to them, to me, to anyone who looked closely, that my life had meaning beyond their approval. I stepped through the grand double doors into the foyer, where a sea of polished smiles and champagne flutes awaited. Conversations faltered, heads turned. People recognized me, some from local news features, some from whispers over the years. My parents, stationed near the grand staircase, froze for half a second before their expressions smoothed into polite masks. Nathan was the first to approach. He looked the same as ever. Perfect suit, perfect tie, the same easy grin that could charm a room. "Caroline," he said, drawing out my name like he was tasting it for the first time in years. "Didn't expect you." "That makes two of us," I replied evenly. He laughed a fraction too loudly, glancing toward our parents. My mother's eyes were sharp behind her practiced smile, my father's lips pressed thin. Dinner was held in the ballroom, long tables draped in white linen, crystal glasses catching the light of the chandeliers. I was seated, not by accident, halfway down the main table, directly across from a city councilman and his wife. My family clustered at the head. From there, they could see me but not easily reach me. Halfway through the first course, it happened. A board member from the Veterans Outreach Alliance rose to speak. She thanked donors, recognized volunteers, and then paused. "And tonight," she said, her voice carrying over the clink of silverware, "we have the honor of being joined by someone whose service to this country is nothing short of extraordinary, Colonel Caroline Hale." The room turned toward me. Applause rose, warm and genuine. I stood, keeping my shoulders square, my expression calm. "Thank you," I said simply. No speech, no deflection, just the truth in my presence. As I sat back down, I caught my mother's gaze. For the first time in my life, she looked uncertain. But the real moment came later, when the dancing started. Guests moved to the polished floor, laughter spilling over the music. I stood at the edge, content to watch, when an older man in a perfectly cut navy suit approached. "Colonel Hale," he said, extending his hand. "It's been a long time." I recognized him instantly. Captain Michael Jennings. Older now, but unmistakable. The man I'd pulled from the burning transport in Helmand Province. "I'm here tonight because of you," he said simply, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "If you hadn't gone in that day, I wouldn't be standing here. My family wouldn't be standing here." A hush rippled outward. People stopped mid-step on the dance floor. The councilman across the room turned toward us. My parents heard it. I knew they did. I didn't look at them. I looked at Michael, holding his hand firmly. "I'm glad you made it home," I said. The applause that followed was different this time, less polite, more charged. People glanced between me and my family, connecting dots they couldn't ignore. It was subtle, but I felt it. The shift in the room's center of gravity. For once, it wasn't at the head of the table. It was here with me, and my family, every last one of them, had to watch from the sidelines. The truth came out the way ugly truths often do, not in one clean break, but in cracks that spread until the whole facade collapses. It started with a conversation I didn't intend to overhear. The gala was winding down, the music softer now, clusters of guests murmuring near the exit as they waited for their cars. I'd stepped out onto the side terrace for a breath of cool air, away from the heat of the ballroom. That's when I heard Nathan's voice from the shadows just around the corner. "She shouldn't be here," he was saying, low and tense. She's here because of you. My mother snapped back, her words clipped. You and your father should have kept your mouths shut years ago. But no, you had to push her out, and now she's back to ruin everything. There was a pause, and then my father's voice, sharp and cold. It was her choice. She reported me. Don't you dare pretend she didn't know what she was doing. For a moment, the air seemed to thin. I had suspected, of course, that my father's business dealings weren't as clean as the brochures made them look, but hearing him admit it was something else entirely. My mother's voice softened, almost pleading. We survived that because she kept quiet about certain things. If she had gone public, you'd have lost everything. We all would have, but you can't expect her to forgive. Forgive? My father interrupted, his voice rising. She destroyed her place in this family the moment she chose her uniform over her blood. I leaned against the cold stone railing, my pulse steady. So there it was, the real reason I'd been cast out, the unspoken truth beneath every clipped phone call, every missed holiday. I hadn't been exiled for failing them. I'd been exiled for not helping them lie. I could have stepped out then, confronted them, forced the issue in front of the few guests lingering nearby. But no, not yet. The timing wasn't right. Instead, I waited until the next morning. The Hale family had a tradition: post-gala brunch at the country club. I'd never been invited, but this time I walked in like I owned the place. Heads turned, forks paused mid-air. My family sat at the usual table by the window. My mother in cream again, Nathan scrolling through his phone, my father sipping coffee. I didn't ask permission. I didn't even greet them. I simply pulled out a chair and sat down. You want to know why I'm here? I said, keeping my voice calm enough to carry, but not so loud as to draw the staff's immediate attention. My father's jaw tightened. I can't imagine why. I'm here, I said, because I'm done letting you tell my story. I'm done being erased. I looked directly at my father. Yes, I reported you, because you are falsifying contracts, cooking bids, and stealing from people who trusted you. I didn't go public because I believed even then that protecting your name mattered to this family. But you know what? All I got in return was exile, silence, and lies about who I am. The table went still. My mother's fingers clenched around her coffee cup. Nathan's eyes darted toward the other diners, who were now watching openly. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, I said. I don't need it. And I'm not here to destroy you, though God knows I could. I'm here because the truth has been buried long enough. You want to be respected? Earn it. Stop pretending the problem was me. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my father's voice, low and venomous. You've made your point. No, I said, rising from my chair. Not yet. But I will. I walked out without looking back. The weight in my chest strangely lighter. The truth was out, not in headlines, not in courtrooms, but in their own dining room, where the people who mattered to them most could see the cracks for themselves. They'd built their lives on a foundation of appearances, and I'd just made sure everyone knew the ground beneath them wasn't as steady as it looked. Regret is a strange thing. You can see it in a person's eyes before they ever say a word. That week I saw it everywhere, in places I'd never expected. It started with Nathan. 3 days after the brunch, he showed up at the small apartment I'd been renting. He stood in the hallway, hands jammed into his coat pockets like he was holding himself together. I didn't know, he said as soon as I opened the door. I leaned against the frame. Didn't know what? That Dad was lying? That Mum was complicit? Or that you were perfectly happy to believe them because it was easier? His eyes dropped to the floor. All of it, he admitted. I told myself you were the problem because that's what they wanted me to believe. It was convenient. I didn't have to face the fact that I let them push you out. I studied him for a long moment. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't deflecting. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the weight of the truth had been pressing on him ever since that morning at the club. You can't undo it, I said quietly. I know, he said, but I can stop making it worse. I didn't invite him in, but I didn't close the door on him either. That was enough for now. The next encounter was stranger. My mother. It was a Saturday afternoon. I was walking through the local farmer's market when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. Being watched, I turned to see her standing at the end of the row. Cream sweater, sunglasses, clutching a paper bag. We didn't speak at first. She just walked toward me, her steps measured. When she stopped in front of me, I could see her face fully. There was no anger there, no condescension, just something tired. I didn't think you'd actually say it, she said. Or, say what? The truth, out loud in front of people who matter to us. To you, I corrected. She flinched almost imperceptibly. Then she sighed. You're right. To me, to your father, and maybe I've spent too long protecting his name at the expense of yours. The admission was so unexpected I didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't an apology. My mother didn't give those, but it was something. I can't change what's already done, she said, but I can stop pretending you were wrong to do what you did. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a crack in the wall she'd built around herself. The real shock came a week later at the country club, of all places. My father, Charles Hale, the man who'd told me to my face that I'd destroyed my place in the family, approached me while I was waiting for a coffee at the bar. I've been thinking, he said without preamble. That's dangerous for you, I replied. To my surprise, he didn't snap back. He just nodded, almost to himself. I still think you were wrong to go to the board, but I also know I wouldn't be sitting here if you'd gone no further. It was the closest thing to gratitude I would ever get from him. I didn't do it for you, I said. I know, he replied. That's why it matters. He walked away before I could respond. In the weeks that followed, the ripple effects spread further than I expected. Old friends of the family reached out quietly, some to distance themselves from my parents, others to express a kind of retroactive respect. A city councilwoman I barely knew stopped me in the grocery store to say, "What you did took courage." Even the board at Hales & Co. made a move. I heard through the grapevine that they'd begun auditing contracts more aggressively, that Charles had been quietly removed from certain decision-making processes. I didn't need to see their regret written in headlines. I could feel it in the way the ground was shifting beneath them. And for once, I wasn't the one scrambling to keep my footing. I hadn't forgiven them, not yet, but the power dynamic had changed. The daughter they'd erased had stepped back into the frame, and no one could pretend she wasn't there anymore. The morning was cool, the kind of early spring air that carries the promise of change without announcing it too loudly. I sat on the small balcony of my apartment, coffee in hand, watching the sun slip over the skyline. For the first time in years, my chest didn't feel tight when I thought about my family. Not because they'd suddenly become the people I wished they were, they hadn't. Not because we'd reconciled or found some cinematic middle ground, we hadn't. But because I'd stopped waiting for them to be my source of worth. The past months had been a kind of reckoning, a dismantling of the quiet lie I'd lived under for decades, that if I just achieved enough, sacrificed enough, swallowed enough hurt, I'd finally earn a permanent place at their table. What I understood now was that some tables are built to exclude you from the start, and no amount of bending will change the shape of the seat. I thought about the flight, the middle seat in row 30, the way they hadn't looked back. I thought about the gala, the applause that had nothing to do with them. I thought about my father's almost gratitude, my mother's tired admission, Nathan's halting attempt at something like remorse. None of it erased the years, none of it returned what had been taken, but it gave me clarity. I'd built a life in service to something greater than myself, and that meant more than their approval ever could. The men and women I'd served with, they were my real family. The people who looked me in the eye and saw what I brought to the table without needing me to shrink first, they were my people. The call came mid-morning. It was from the Department of Defense. A formal voice told me I'd been selected for an honorary promotion, Brigadier General, post-retirement, recognition for service that had, as the letter later said, left a permanent mark on the safety and dignity of others. When I hung up, I didn't feel the rush I expected. Instead, I felt something steadier, quieter, like a weight shifting off my shoulders, leaving me lighter but still grounded. I didn't tell my family, not out of spite, but because I didn't need to. This was mine. This was for me. That weekend, I drove to the coast. I walked along the pier at sunset, the wind lifting my hair, the waves slapping against the wooden post below. As the sky went from gold to deep violet, I thought about James, about the soldiers whose names I'd never know, about the strangers who had stepped into my path just long enough to remind me I mattered. I thought about the girl I'd been at 19, sitting on a friend's couch with a duffel bag at her feet because her parents told her to leave. And I thought about the woman I was now, standing alone on the pier, not because she'd been pushed there, but because she'd chosen it. Some battles you fight to win, others you fight to walk away whole. This was one of the latter. I turned back toward my car, the salt air clinging to my skin, the hum of the ocean at my back. The war with my family wasn't over in the way people imagine. There were no signed truces, no hugs or tearful reunions. But I had my peace, and that was enough. When I drove home that night, I didn't take the long way to avoid the Hale neighborhood. I didn't need to. They could live their lives in the world they'd built, and I'd live mine in the one I'd chosen. Separate, strong, free, and maybe, just maybe, somewhere deep down, they'd remember that night at the gala, that moment at the country club, that day on the flight, times they were forced to see me, times they couldn't rewrite or erase. Because dignity isn't something someone gives you, it's something you claim piece by piece until it's yours forever. And mine, finally, was untouchable.